Hey, everybody, it's Andrew. And once again, I'm talking to awesome people and their dogs. Um, that's Teddy, who's super cute. But more importantly, for our chat for the next little while, is Tim Palmer. Tim, thank you so much for joining me for this.
Andrew, thank you so much for having me on. I'll just put Teddy down here. It's so
Oh,
lovely to
well,
get a chance to talk to you again.
he looks a little sad about being shunted to the back, actually.
No, he's fine. He's very important because he helps me when the high frequencies get out of control. He just leaves the room,
All
so
right.
it's always a good sign, you know.
So that's it. So it used to be you do a bunch of cocaine. Now you just know the dog has left the room.
Exactly.
Excellent. Excellent. So, for those of you who don't know, you should know, and you're going to know. And I'm not going to bother recapping or giving a potted version of anything because I figure the way these usually go best is we're just going to walk all the way through your career, but not it's not stopping everywhere. And I've got a couple of things that I've picked out that maybe are a little more under the radar, but projects that I absolutely love that you've worked on. But I'd love to get this sort of, your creation story. So you started in the 80s in London. Did you grow up in London or were you outside of London?
I did. I was originally born in Newcastle, and my parents moved to London when I was about 8. And like so many of us in the 70s, my first love of music was everything from the Sweet to T-Rex, all that sort of thing. And basically, my parents worked in television, and once punk music hit in, that was it for me. That was the real turning point. It was the Damned, it was the Clash, it was the Jam. And when I finished my schooling at 18, it wasn't looking too promising, to be honest. And I had the opportunity to, through my father at one of his shows, meet a record producer. And that was a massive thing for me. And he invited me to see his studio in London, which was called Utopia Studios. And his name was
Right.
Phil Wayman. And Phil Wayman, and unless you're familiar, produced the Suite, and he produced the Bay City Rollers. And he was the ultimate 70s, everything that you can imagine a 70s record producer to look like. He turned up in a Rolls Royce. He's got the big office with all the discs on the wall. He was amazing.
Wow.
And
And was he the psychedelic 70s one or the turtleneck 70s one?
No, more turtleneck, I'd say.
Right. Okay.
But he invited me when I met him through my dad to come and have a look, just to have a look at his studio. And as a 16, 17-year-old kid, I was just like blown away. This was just mind blowing to me. So I asked him at the end of this sort of little tour, I said, how do you get a job in a place like this? And he said, well, basically you can start, put your name on the list. And if you get the gig, you can make the tea and clean up and do the sweeping up and all that sort of stuff, which in a way in America we call runner. But in England, it was a tea boy. So I was just totally put my name on the list. I'll wait. I would love to be part of this. And I went up for an interview. And eventually, after about a year, I was offered a place. And I got my first break to start as an apprentice in a London recording studio. And it was incredible.
And were your parents on the production side of television, or what were they doing? I mean, had you seen control rooms before? Did you know the geeky tech side of it all, or was this the first time you'd really seen it?
I'd seen the geeky tech side of television, absolutely. My father started off as a film cameraman, and in fact, on the very first rediffusion broadcast on ITV, my father, his first job was he was called a tracker, and he would hold on to the cables behind the cameras and follow them around because, of course, they were so big, and
Yeah.
that was his first job. So yeah, and he became a television producer, and my mother worked in TV news, so I'd been with them to work and sat at the back and tried to keep
Right.
them
Right.
and stuff like that. But I had never seen what I loved, which was the recording of music. So this was a whole different thing to me.
Now, just really quickly, we were talking about your accent before and how you've retained it, having lived half your life in the States. But can I just say you managed to escape Newcastle without a trace of it?
Yeah, well, why, amen. I come from Newcastle, but no, it's because I moved at 8 years of age. That's why, and I think it just disappeared when I got to London, probably because I was scared to speak in my Geordie
Right.
accent. But yeah, that one fell to the wayside. But
Because that is a very special accent. I can
it is.
understand a whole lot of accents and not that one. That
It
it's
is,
brutal.
and it's and Newcastle, of course, with Sting and and Brian Ferry and Mark Knopfler and Brian Johnson, and so many great musicians that have come out of Newcastle.
Yeah.
And as we talk, I'll tell you about when I got to work with Sting or whatever like that. But
Yeah.
it was a great. One of the interesting things, you'll find this funny, was when I bought in 1973 or whenever it was Ballroom Blitz by The Sweet. I brought it home and I put it on the record player, and I said to my dad, "There's something not quite right about this. It seems too fast." And my dad's like, "Don't be ridiculous. What are you talking about?" I said, No, it sounds too fast, Dad." And that was the end of that. When I went to Utopia to go for my interview, Phil, of course, had produced the song. And I was taken around the studio by the head of maintenance, a guy called Ian Davidson. And I said to Ian, "Oh, I can't wait to ask Phil about my record because it was too fast." And he said, "I'd rather you didn't do that, actually." And I said, "Why? Why?" And he said, "Well, actually, I used to be a mastering engineer. And on the first run of Ballroom Blitz in 1970, whatever it was, 3, I left the vari-speed in. And I got into a lot of trouble. And I'm not sure whether Phil has realized that I was the actual mastering engineer. So I'd rather you didn't bring it up." But that was pretty strange, I think, that after all these years, I finally got the answer.
That's great to close that circle like that. So
Yeah.
now, what year was it that you started at Utopia as the T-boy-ish?
I'm thinking it was about 1981.
Well, because I'm asking it now. Only obviously the internet is full of misinformation, but according to the internet, you've got a production credit on a Kajagoogoo record in 1982. Is
Yes,
that
that's right. That's right.
so? How that is a pretty fast trip from T-boy to producer.
Yeah, and of course that was very symbolic of that time. Opportunity often presented itself by somebody being sick and not turning up to a session, and you stepped in. In one case, a kitchen, an engineer's kitchen flooded, and I stepped in and did a session. So as an assistant, and I must say that being an assistant engineer, I loved being an assistant engineer. I mean, it was, to me, that was the perfect situation to be able to sit and learn and watch other people and just be able to just help out and absorb the whole thing. And at Utopia in those days, studios were booked because of their engineers. Outside
Yeah.
engineers was something that came in much later. So our studio engineers were a guy called John Maxwith, who recorded the Dave Clark 5. We had James Guthrie and Andy Guthrie, who'd worked on The Wall. We had Peter and Greg Walsh. I mean, we had great engineers. So the artists that were coming through were people like Stevie Wonder and the Dire Straits and Heatwave. And to be an assistant on sessions like that was just incredible.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny how late the staff engineers sort of stopped in the UK, because it stopped a bit earlier in the States. But everyone I've talked to who sort of came up through the UK, it was staff engineers. And sometimes you would start as a staff engineer on a project and then follow the project to another studio to finish.
Correct.
But then you'd come back. Everybody had a home base, and not just like, oh, this is a studio I like. It was as good as salary, but without salary.
That's
Even
right.
right
And
to the end.
the first outside engineers to come into Utopia, you're right, were Americans. They were brought in for projects and they were brought from America. But, you know, being an assistant for Rod Temperton on a Heatwave album that Barry Blue was producing is incredible. I
Yeah.
mean, to be able to sit and watch Rod arrange vocals and build up all the vocals, and I be the man who's just in charge of the tape machine, which, as you know, is an art form that sadly we don't need anymore. But
Well, but
it was
especially
quite
while
scary.
building up vocals on tape, and I'm sure there are lots of bounces going on while that's happening, and
Absolutely.
that's a pretty
It was scary. And it was quite an honor when Rod booked in again and said, I want young Tim to be my assistant. So, you know, that was a nice thing for me in those days. But we had Colin Thurston, who'd worked with David Bowie, and he produced Howard Jones and Duran Duran. He would come in and I would be his assistant as well. So I got to be an assistant for some really, you know, heavy hitters. And going back to your original question, the Kajagoogoo project was a project that Colin Thurston had come in to produce. And he produced Duran and, of course, was friends with Nick Rhodes. So the two of them had decided to produce this new band called Kajagoogoo. And I was the assistant on the session. And Colin and Nick didn't really want to put in the hours. They didn't want to go past about 7. They wanted to head out to the restaurants and chill out with their girlfriends or whatever. So it was down to Muggins here to take over, which of course was not a problem. I was totally happy with that. So they'd say, okay, well, we'll see you in the morning, and we'll have a listen to what Tim's done and make sure it's okay, and then we'll move on. So I would be up till midnight, and Colin would listen in the morning, and it was just a great vibe. And when it came to the end of an album, something else that's a long lost art was, we need to make some B-sides for the singles. And Colin and Nick didn't really fancy the idea of bothering with the B-sides. So they said, well, why don't you just work with Tim on the B-sides? And I was like, okay, great, excellent.
Man.
So I said to the band, I said, look, is there any way that I can hear your demo of the B-side so I can just, get a sense of it before we start? And they were like, no problem. So I went home and I listened to it, wrote some ideas down. We did the session. I contributed some things. It went very well. And I thought that would be the end of that. A couple of B-sides under my belt, which was great. But the label loved them and decided to put one on the album. And because I contributed, I asked them if it seemed unreasonable for a co-production credit. And they just said, of course. So I went from being the assistant on the album, and I got my first co-production credit, and I got my first gold disc.
Amazing.
But that was the time. That's the time, right? It's just the way it was.
Yeah. But look, it's obviously it's a testament, because I know some people who've managed to get a break early on, and even if that went well, it's not something that can be sustained necessarily. And you have sustained the hell out of it since then. But sticking on the early side, so that's your first production credit.
Yeah.
Then you have this gigantic hit as a mixer on I Just Died in Your Arms.
Yeah.
I mean, we can use this language. That was fucking huge.
Yeah, it was.
That was relatively early on as well, right? I mean, that's not that many years. That's 3 years into your career or so, right?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest takeaway, of course, for any younger engineers who may be listening, is that if you're connected to something that is special, a great song, a great performance, and you happen to be the person in charge of mixing it, you're pretty much 90% there. And I happened to be the guy who, when they booked the session, there was a bunch of engineers, and Annie from the studio said, Tim, do you want to do this session in the remix room? It's a band called Cutting Crew. And I said, I'm in. And I was presented with I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight as the mix. So, once again, that's just, get things like that. It's just pretty special that those things fall into your lap, because you can't plan for that shit,
No. And for anybody who thinks they haven't heard the song, you've heard the song. Just listen to that chorus. I mean, you can hear it in your head as soon as you hear the lyrics. I mean, it's a really big song. Now, obviously, that must have helped set you up to continue your career. But so you're still staff at that point.
Yeah, still staff then, yeah.
And how much longer did you last at Utopia then?
No, well, I was living... when I moved up to becoming an engineer at Utopia, the studio was so happy with my enthusiasm, I guess, that they said, have you got any mates who would like to be the new assistant? And I said, I do. One of my close friends from school would love to do it. So another engineer mixer that you may be aware of is a guy called Chris Sheldon. And Chris Sheldon became my assistant as I became an engineer, and which was fantastic because we were pals already. And we managed to get a really grotty basement apartment that was connected to the studio where we could live. So we lived in this place, and it was great because when we were both assisting and young engineers, it was the 80s. There was a lot of excesses going on. Artists were very rarely on time to a session, and we were up till 3 or 4 in the morning. So we needed every bit of sleep we could get. So we came up with this great idea. You'll like this. So we went into the Studio A, and we ran a mic to the front door where the buzzer was. And then we took a split from the speaker's console, and ran the speaker cable through the garden and into our apartment, and put a speaker up in our apartment. So when we were both really knackered, we'd be asleep in this apartment, and you'd hear this, go, oh my God, they're here. And you could literally get dressed, run through the back door, through the emergency exit doors, and get to them to let the band in. It was amazing.
That's dedication. And that makes it hard to leave the studio.
It did, but that's what it was, wasn't it? I mean, I can't even imagine how many hours I spent sleeping, we get to, when before I moved up to London, it was too late to go home. You just sleep on the couch. I mean, that was part of what we did in those days. And that's why this pandemic, quite interestingly for me, I mean, obviously it's been very tough for many people in many situations. But for me personally, it's not really much different to making an album in the 90s when you'd say goodbye to your family, be stuck with about 3 or 4 people for 3 or 4 months and barely come out to see the light. I mean,
Yeah.
that's sort of what we do, isn't it? Or what we did, at least.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that from talking to a lot of people who do what we do, the work hasn't really changed, but it's like, I mean, I found my attention span was terrible the first few weeks. Like I really couldn't settle down and work, and even though technically there's nothing different, but then once you get into it, it's nice. I think we're incredibly lucky to have a release that is normal work, as opposed to trying to find something else to replace that with. So, and it's, it's worked out all right. And
No,
but it's also given a lot of us the impetus to try and do a few other things. Like I'm doing these interviews, which has been
yeah,
just amazing for me. I mean, I love, because first of all, I get to reconnect with the people, but also, I mean, the stuff you learn, I've already learned enough from this that like I'm good, but we're going to keep going because there's so much more to talk about, and it's a gift in a way. So I think it's trying to take as much advantage of it as you can,
it
because
is.
with
You're
all the
right.
bad stuff comes the extra time. So
Absolutely.
trying to find something to do.
I
So
mean, the pause has been nice too. Actually, for me, the pause has been nice. I mean, as I said to you before, this I'm entering my 5th decade now doing this, and the pause has been nice to actually sit back and realize just, sometimes it's very easy to take for granted what we do for a living and complain about it. But when I'm sitting mixing music, I'm just in another world. And when I get this pause and I look around at the things that I take for granted, it's been really nice to actually, evaluate that and think, okay, this is good. And it's also
yeah,
been an opportunity for me, as you know, I'm a trustee at the Academy, to step up, and I've called in a lot of favors to artists that I've worked with over the years to donate things for Music Cares. And we've got a really good auction coming up soon. And I've got some guitars that have been signed. Robert Plant's agreed to sign one. And I think Willie Nelson's going to do one. And, just trying to really step up and help, because unlike England, America, the musicians they've really taken it on the chin, and it's been tough.
yeah. I mean, it's not. It's a bit better here, but not much. I mean, I think it's the same thing where you have to prove a lot of things which are very difficult for someone who's a true independent contractor to prove before you can get assistance. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and it's great. We'll definitely come back to the Recording Academy and the charity work and things like that. But let's finish out the first decade of your career. And
Hmm.
just so what was the transition from staff at Utopia to deciding like, okay, now it's time to go do something else? Like, was there a specific thing, or was it a project that took you away from it and you kind of never went back, or did you just decide it was time to do it?
I started to have relationships and working with specific producers. One of them was a German producer called Zeus B. Held, and he had worked on a band called Fashion in the 80s. And he started to ask me to work on projects with him. We did the Dead or Alive first album at CBS, which was fantastic. We did an album with John Fox, and John Fox used to be in Ultravox. And we did various projects together. And I was slowly, becoming having to ask my boss, is it okay if I go to this studio for a while? And is it okay if I go here for a while? And it was that sort of thing that started it all rolling for me. And Zeus was managed at the time by Sandy Robertson at World's End. And,
Right.
World's End was fairly young at that point. They'd been pretty established. But Sandy met me through Zeus, and he asked if I would like management. And it was when I got management, and I've been with Sandy now for over 35 years. But it was at that point that Sandy said, look, would you like to come and work? And he began to bring in projects from outside, from other labels and things like that. And I guess that was the impetus to finally to leave Utopia.
Right. But it sounds like it was a rather soft transition anyway, because it was already sort of happening.
It was, and with Phil, I'm still friends with Phil Wayman today, and we speak to each other through LinkedIn and all that stuff. And I mean, at the beginning, I would always try and come back to Utopia to do as much of the work as I could, and
Right.
it was fine. It was fine.
Right. And I'm sure at this point you're no longer living in the basement flat next door.
No, it was starting to move up. I got a place. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, it was just so great. I mean, another producer that I would assist for was Richard James Burgess, and I was able to work with him on Landscape, and I was able to work with him on Spandau Ballet and all these sort of projects. And it was just a really heady time.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, music was huge, and the English music scene was gigantic then. I mean, it's always big, but that seems to be like a really particular time, especially in the sort of pop, electronic to rock genres. There, that was really exploding in a way that people saw as influential, in the way that the early, the Beatles era was influential. The post-rock era is influential. The punk era, a lot of that came out of here, and that was right at that time. And you're right in the thick of it.
You were, and funnily enough, when you start to think, oh, I think I've managed to have got this now. I think I've figured this out. I realized too late that most of the sessions I'd done, I've been plugging in DMX systems or Oberheim DMX systems and Lindrums and things like that. And my knowledge of actually recording a band in a very organic sense was limited. And it was during the 80s when I got the opportunity to work with Robert Plant, who actually approached me. Sandy put my name up, and he approached me because he liked the fact that I hadn't done anything so organic and so rock. He approached to work with me because I'd done Dead or Alive and because I'd worked with Kajagoogoo. But there I was working with Robert for the first time with a full band, and I realized at that point, wow, I've got a lot to learn. And it's amazing to me that you get these opportunities in those days when maybe you weren't quite ready. Nowadays, by the time people get an opportunity to do work with a major artist, they're pretty prepared. But I was in a studio called Marcus with a full band. I had Richie Hayward from Little Feat. I had the full band with Robert there. And I was on a Harrison board. I'd never worked on a Harrison. And I was struggling, I'll be honest. And at one point, the session was a bit slow because I couldn't figure out 7 headphone balances. And the studio owner was in his office, and Robert went in and started complaining about the studio being no good. And the owner of the studio said, "It's not our studio, mate. That's that kid you got in there. He doesn't know what the fuck he's doing." And luckily for me, Robert didn't. He enjoyed working with me, and he said, "No, it isn't." And he stuck up for me, and we worked through the problems, and I managed to stay on. But it's incredible, really, the opportunities that you get sometimes when you're not actually fully prepared, but you learn very quickly. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I know Robert a little bit because I live really close to him now,
Yeah,
and I mean, it couldn't be more lovely with people. Like, he
absolutely.
really does get that, and you'd think somebody with that level of success that early would be very quick to, like, hold on, why isn't this like every great session I've ever had, and find somebody to blame. And it's never about that. Never about that. It's a really great point. And you did basically, I mean, he'd done what, 2 solo records before you worked with him?
Yeah.
You worked starting on the third. And
Yes.
obviously he had the Zeppelin thing, but Little by Little, I think, is really the song, to me, at least from the outside, that
Yeah.
said, holy shit, he's got a solo career that's going to rival anything he's done before. Whereas before that, how could you ever even come close to that? It's a really difficult, I think he's said that he's a very hard act for himself to follow. But Little by Little, you want to talk about that for a
Well,
sec?
yeah, Little by Little, I think, is special as well. There's some experiments on that record that went a little bit too far into the 80s, but that's the time period. You can't go back. That's what we were playing around with new ideas. But Little by Little was definitely my favorite. A funny story, and I've told this probably too many times, but you'll enjoy it, is that when we were setting up the drum sounds and Richie's out there and we got the ambient mics and we're moving things around, Robert kept on making references to certain Led Zeppelin songs that he loved. And I, of course, like everybody, when I started in a studio, I was in there for 20 hours a day. So I sort of stopped listening to music when I got the job as an assistant. And I didn't get that luxury back till later in my life, but I was working all the time. And my music was punk. So I really was not a Led Zeppelin fan at all, which was sort of cool in a way. And he would be referencing songs that I'd never heard of that I really should have heard of. So he would say, the vibe on this song is sort of Misty Mountain Harp, when the levee breaks. And I would be looking, I don't know that one actually, Robert. And he'd say, well, what about this one? And I'd say, I know Stairway to Heaven. I know that song quite well. And he said, can you tell me what Led Zeppelin albums you actually have? Why don't you do that? And I said to him, I'll be honest, Robert, I don't own any Led Zeppelin albums. And he said, well, what kind of records did you like then? I said, I love The Clash. I love The Damned. And he said, I love The Damned. I love New Rose. That's a great drum sound. And we talked about that for a while. And he was really fine about it. And in fact, I think he almost enjoyed the fact that I wasn't sort of beholden to his past, because he enjoys moving on. And the next day he walked into the studio, and I swear this is true, he brought a pile of albums, because it was still albums. He plonked them down on the control room, on the console next to me, and said, Timmy, check out my old band, see if you like them.
Nice. Nice. Not too long after I'd met him, he gave me a stack of CDs of the solo stuff, including the albums you did, which it's great. He's very generous that way. But I think it brings up a really important point in a way, especially as a producer, is that if you knew those songs really well, and if you had been a Zeppelin geek the way a lot of people were, and I don't know, you couldn't really be a Zeppelin recording geek back then the way you can be now, but you would still know about the Glyn Johns 3-mic technique, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I think that the mistake is ever trying to recapture the recording or the technical parts of something. It's just to say, what does this song feel like? And then you go for it the same way, because it's a different drummer, it's a different arrangement around it. It can't be that Led Zeppelin song, but it can easily have the feel of it. It can be ethereal, it can be a modal thing, it can have acoustic instruments versus electric instruments, more room mics, less room, but that's as close as you can get anyway. It's like we see it all the time musically, where people are doing copycat things, and you can't do it as a producer or an engineer, because you're never going to capture the essence of what was amazing about that thing, because it isn't the mic placement. No, it's something about the moment in the song. So I'm sure it worked in your favor.
Yeah, I think it probably did ultimately. And, the nice thing about working on that album was that we developed a relationship and trusted each other. And when he moved to become the new band, where it was a whole new band around him, I was the only person that carried over from the album before. And I felt a lot more confident by that point. And Now and Zen was the fruits of our working together on that next album. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And for me personally, I was starting to get involved in music that maybe a direction that I didn't really feel that was right for me, for my own personal taste. Because as I said, I'd grown up coming through new wave and punk rock, and I was starting to do all this synthy stuff and pop stuff, and I ended up making a lot of pop records. And I didn't want to do that. And I was lucky, because by working and by being picked by Robert because of that, it gave me the credibility to be able to go to a rock band and say, I can work with you. And from Robert, I think, is probably how I ended up working with bands like The Mission and the Mighty Lemon Drops and even David Bowie. I mean, it was probably because of that. So it was so important for me, and so lucky that he took that chance on me.
Yeah. So just speaking genre-wise and forgetting about any kind of chronological order. So what's the project you've done that you think is closest to sort of your own roots in The Clash and The Call and The Damned and The Jam and bands like that? Just curious if you've ever been making a record and thought, oh man, this is like what I grew up on in a way, or you got the same feeling from it.
Well, I don't think I ever really did end up sort of following in that respect.
Well,
I did a lot of alternative rock music, which I love.
Tons of very cool stuff.
And that was the area that pleased me the most, I guess, at that particular point. I loved working with The Mission. I loved working with, Gene Loves Jezebel and all those sort of things. And eventually with bands like Tears for Fears, I loved that sort of combination of all that. But I never really worked with anything. I guess in a sense, Pearl Jam were pushing back against an era before in the way punk was. But I certainly wasn't aware of quite such a bold statement at that moment. But they certainly were doing that. But I've just always, felt very strongly about, do I like it? do I love the songs? Are the performances good? What can I bring to this project? And that's sort of basically it, ultimately.
Yeah, and I think that even like you're saying, working on a lot of pop records or synth-based records that wasn't necessarily what you're into, you want to be able to get back and like, okay, I want to work with a rock band, et cetera, et cetera. But while you're working on those records, you still make them a record that you love while you're making it. It's not like you just twiddle your thumbs in the back of the control room till it's over, you
Oh,
know, and
absolutely. I mean,
in
it's
some ways you work harder.
yeah. I mean, our job, I think, ultimately as a music producer is to help an artist achieve what they want in their mind. And if you can do that and make a great record that appeals to a lot of people at the same time, then you're onto a winner, and you're going to be asked back again. And one thing that I do pride myself on is that I worked with most of the artists I've ever done 2 or 3 times, because I
Yes.
think there is a way to make recording fun and to be respectful of their vision. Reeves Gabrels from Tin Machine has a great quote that I use. I nick it all the time. But he said, always remember, you're not the word, you're just a highlighter pen. And it is true, because we are a highlighter pen. We are looking at something and we're going, wow, that's fantastic. How can I make sure that this is not lost? But we're not writing it. And I think keeping that sort of that truism in your head is very important, and not to forget that we are successful at what we do because of the material that we're involved in. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
it's
a great
just,
way to put it too.
it's just, it really is. I mean, um, the biggest songs that people will ever remember my work by are the great songs. I mean, when you've got a great song, it's funny. I tell you, an interesting thing is when you're mixing an album, I often make the same mistake, and I'll mix an album and I'll think, wow, this song I'm working on now, I'm killing it. This is great. This is sounding great. And then I think, no, 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 this is a great song. And this is a great performance. That's why, because when you've got a great song, you go, oh, okay, so the guitars are a bit loud. I like it with the guitars loud. Sounds pretty good. And then you go, I like it. I like it with the drums loud. Sounds pretty good with the drums loud too. Because guess what? It's fucking great. And there's quite a lot of flexibility within great. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a really good point. It is a
And
really
it's
good
your
point.
chance then to define a sound at that point. You can go, fuck, this is great. I can define a sound here for this at this moment. It's not like, oh, the only way this will work is this way. You have some
Right.
options when you're working with something good.
Right. And I've come across the same thing while tracking, where the band is out in the room and they're working on a song and everything just sounds terrible. And just everything. And then you say, well, let's take a break and move on to another song for a bit because this one's not happening. They start playing another song and everything sounds incredible. And it's
Mm.
nothing to do with the engineering or the microphones or
Yeah.
even the instruments because they haven't changed them. It's that it's a better song. It's just something about it works. And it's bizarre, but kick and snare will change song to song if you don't change anything.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I went through an experience at a studio that well, Rockfield, many years ago with a band. I won't mention them, but I was struggling with the drum sound, struggling, and I kept changing microphones and moving it, and I suddenly got to a point where I thought, okay, I know that the Robert Plant's drummer's not far away because we're in Monmouthshire. Maybe he can bring down his kit. Maybe that'll be the thing. So he brought his kit down, he set it up, and he put the mics up for us. And I was in the control room, and it was sounding great. And I thought, okay, well, how'd you go? And the drummer went out and he played it, and it's like, still terrible.
Yeah, yeah, definitely better not to name names here.
No,
Um,
no.
so when did you make the decision to move to LA and why?
Well, I went through a divorce, and my manager had moved to LA and set up World's End America. And more projects that he was getting were in the States. And I was spending most of my time on airplanes, just flying back and forth. And to me, it was a fresh start and a great
Right.
opportunity. And I always, loved working in American studios. They were just insane. I mean, compared to England, where you're looking around, where's the guy who's gonna make a cup of tea for us? Oh, and in America, it was like you have 3 assistants or whatever, and it was just fantastic. I remember there was one guy who assisted me at Record Plant. Makes me laugh. His name was Brandon, and I was working with Tears for Fears. And I would go into the live room and I'd be sort of looking at the drum mics thinking, I wonder where I'm going to put them. And I'd go in my pocket and I was smoking at the time. I'd take a cigarette out, and as I took the cigarette out and started to move it, I would see out of the periphery of my eyes a guy running in slow motion with his cigarette lighter, and he'd go, but that was how enthusiastic and it was just great. It was really great.
Right. All right. So what year was that you moved?
Oh God, I can't even remember. It's
Early
been
90s?
about, it was around the time. Yeah, it's about, I was working, I did a lot of records. Yeah, I did the Tears for Fears thing then. It must have been early 90s. Yeah, it was after
Right.
Pearl Jam though. It was way after Pearl Jam.
Right.
I did Pearl Jam. That's the weird thing. I did Pearl Jam in the in the countryside of Surrey, which is very not the Seattle sort of vibe that you'd expect.
Right.
But we were in the middle of Surrey in a residential studio, miles away from anywhere. So that was in '92. So it must have been a bit after that.
Right. Well, now's the time to talk about that record then, because we gotta, we have to. So I'm curious if you were sort of aware of that scene, like you were talking about before. They were kind of, the Seattle grunge scene was the answer to the hair metal that had been going on before, the way punk was the answer to the pop going on before. Were you aware of that? Did you feel any sort of connection to that? And how did the Pearl Jam record come about? Was it just sort of a gig and you had no idea it was going to be what it was at the time, which happens quite a bit with huge records? People say, well, did you know? And like, no, it was some work, and it's usually on a smaller scale. But obviously, I mean, that record was absolutely gigantic. So I'm going to make you talk about it.
Well, I'll give you the backstory. So I was asked to do quite a lot of those hair metal bands, especially the ones that wanted to sound like Led Zeppelin after I'd worked with Planty. But as you can see from my discography, I didn't really like that scene. That wasn't my thing. I was working more with sort of goth bands and alternative bands in the UK, and I actually was asked by Jimmy Iovine to do a band called Neverland, and they were the closest I got to doing a more of a traditional hair metal type rock thing. And we made this record at A&M, and I was away from home a long time. And at the end of it, when we got to mixing, Shelley Yackers would pop in. We'd have all these different people popping in. There was a lot of people involved. And for me, it was quite overwhelming because it was one of the first big records I made in America. And it was his first rock record Jimmy had for Interscope. So he brought me into his office one day and he told me that he didn't really feel that I had the right sensibility to mix a rock record for America. And I took it pretty badly. I was, because I'd already had a career up to that point and I was hurt and thought, oh, fuck it then. And I went back to England thinking, I don't know whether America's the right place to be at the moment, And fortunately for me, before that, I'd mixed a little band called Mother Love Bone. And I was asked by Michael Goldson to mix this band, and I mixed this record on my own in LA. And unfortunately, the singer Andrew Wood had died of he got involved in heroin, and he was cleaning up, and he took too much, and usual story. And that whole project was basically over. And after I had finished the Neverland project, Michael Goldson got me a tape and said, look, some of the guys have formed a new band called Pearl Jam. And would I be interested in listening to it and stuff? So I had a listen, and I didn't think that it was, like you said, going to change the world, but I liked it. I thought Eddie had a really unusual voice, and it was quite a strange combination to me because it wasn't really, I wasn't aware of the Seattle sound, but it certainly didn't really feel, because the guitar solos were pretty straightforward rock and roll to me, in that sense. But the music was very, very energetic, and Eddie's vocals were very unique. And anyway, I liked it. I thought it was really cool. And Michael arranged for me to meet the band, and it was my first time meeting the members of Mother Love Bone that I'd never met before. So we agreed not to work in LA, and I said, look, I don't want to be here anymore, especially after the Jimmy incident. And I went over and suggested that we work at Ridge Farm. So they all flew over to the middle of the Surrey countryside, and it was great. It was fantastic. I mean, it was one of those dream low pressure sessions where I loved what I was doing. We had a big neve. The band were all happy. I remember the morning that the Temple of the Dog album came out, and I said, come on, let's jump in the back. We'll drive into Dorking. Let's get all the music papers. And we all sat in the back reading the music papers. And every morning they would stay. I would drive home and I would present the mix to them, and they would chip in with their input. No problem. And we finished the album in probably 10 or 12 days. We did some overdubs. We recorded the solo to a live, which I remember Mike did a few takes, and I put one together. I comped one together, and that wasn't what the band were about. They didn't want a comp solo, and I respected that and said, okay, well, let's just do another one then tomorrow. And he blew that solo out in one go, and it was excellent.
Wow.
So he did that. Eddie did a few backing vocals and bits and bobs, and it was a really enjoyable and easy session to work on. And I had no idea that album would go on to be what it was. But the interesting thing is that during that time, I had this thing where I'd have to remember the time of MTV, right? MTV was on the TV monitor. And I used to, when the tape was rewinding, another thing we've forgotten about, when the tapes were rewinding, I would often take a break for a minute and I'd put the TV on. And you just listen to records around. And it was quite good, really, because sometimes you'd hear something and you'd think, oh, that's pretty cool. I wonder if they would work on this song. It was just always another sort of inspirational thing that you could have on. So we were working, and a lot of the songs that were being played at MTV, I remember one, and Stone and I used to laugh about how it was Winds of Change. Remember the Scorpions song?
Yeah.
And that's where we were musically and sound-wise. We weren't afraid at that point of making something big and using a reverb.
Yeah.
That was fine. Using a delay was fine. All these sort of problems with delays and reverbs and making everything dry came later. So while I was mixing it, I had I didn't feel any pressure to make the record a certain way. And we just did what we thought was right. To me, it was just like telling the story of each song. So at that time, I was really into, pushing the ambient mics a lot in the verse and then killing them all in the middle section and making Eddie's voice go really dry and then back on the reverb. And it was a lot of, there was a lot of space to try things because it was a band recording. There wasn't a lot of stuff on it. And it was just a really enjoyable process, and I'm just very lucky to be involved in it.
That's great. And I love that, it was an easy one that went well. And I think in a way, and I could be totally wrong, I'm just making this up on the fly, but it's like what you say, when you've got this amazing song and you can kind of push it wherever you want, right? You can mix that however you want, but it's your opportunity to do something with it. And I think that album for that time was the album length equivalent of a great song. It's not like you would go through that album and say, oh my God, that's the single. But every song on that record was big.
Absolutely.
Every single one resonated with everybody who was listening to music and who wanted something. And that band delivered it all through the entire record.
They did. And you know what? As far as radio and America was concerned, that record became a bridge. It was the end of the metal phase, but it was also bringing in this new sound. And not intentionally by any stretch of the imagination, I would never say that, but because the record still sounded big, it still sounded pretty good. And it also had, Mike was providing fairly rock traditional solos. So a lot of the people who were listening to rock music had this sort of step across to the new sound. And that album sort of fitted perfectly because it gave you the aggression of the vocals. It gave you traditional rock guitar solos. It still sounded big and powerful, but it didn't go from zero to dry and in your face.
Yeah.
It didn't. And this was a bridge, I feel.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, because I think it gave people context for Soundgarden and for Nirvana and some of the other bands that were maybe a bit heavier or a bit rawer than they would have been comfortable with without Pearl Jam sitting somewhere in between.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
I mean, look, and that I'm not in any way. It sounds so ridiculous because like Smells Like Teen Spirit or Black Hole Sun, those are going to be gigantic no matter what happens. I'm not pretending like they all, but Pearl Jam was kind of the gatekeeper that opened the doors for a lot of people to just be open to things that were not around. It was hair metal all day, every day. I mean, it'd be interesting to look at just the playlists of MTV leading up to that point and sort of what happened too, because huge shift.
And it was a great tonic for me after what Jimmy said, because he said I couldn't mix a rock record for America,
And then
like
you
you turn around and
redefined
go,
what that meant.
yeah. That's very fortunate.
Well played, sir. Well played. All right. So look, a certain Mr. R. Plant has asked me to make sure that you talk about, going back to a little bit the metal thing, your rock god status as a guitar player with a certain Mr. Osbourne.
Yeah. Well, that Ozzy album was a very interesting album to make, because the truth was that he didn't really want to make another record, Ozzy, and part of my job was,
And this
firstly,
is down to earth, just for people
yes,
who don't know.
that's
Yeah.
right. So, I was asked by the label to come in and meet Ozzy, and I met him. And because we both are from the UK, had a lot to do with it. We laughed about the same things. We laughed about Monty Python. We talked about old Benny Hill things, and we immediately had a rapport. And as you know, making records with people, having that rapport is half the battle. Ozzy was on board with trying things, but it was a challenge to get him to come to the studio. Zakk Wylde, the guitar player, incredible guitar player, insane. He was in and out of the band. One minute he was in, next minute he was out. And I was faced with the situation of, look, okay, I have to keep rehearsing this record. So I had Robert Trujillo, who is in Metallica now, and Mike Bordin. And basically we were running through these songs, and Zakk wasn't there. So I said, well, I'm going to do it. And I think they thought I was crazy, quite frankly, because I said, I'll do it. I'll just figure it out. And I sort of bluffed my way through it just so we could get the arrangements together, knowing that Zakk would be in later. And he did eventually come back later. But there was one song that I co-wrote for Ozzy called Gets Me Through. And I wanted it to be really, really simple, like a Sabbath song, all about just, basically the riff being the whole song and being the simplicity of it. It didn't have to be clever. So I did the demo, and when, as I said, the back and forth with Zakk, I ended up in the studio and I said, I'm just going to play the guitars on this song. And I played it, and I was very happy with it. It's funny how you're happy with it when you're the producer, isn't it? I was very happy.
Were you hard on yourself?
I was very tough on myself.
Yeah.
And it was a simple sort of riff. It was sort of, there's a bit of the Cult in there, and Billy's a Friend and stuff. And I wanted it to keep that rawness. And when Zakk came back in, he came in and he played the most insane solo on the song. And the label loved the track, and it ended up becoming the first single. And unfortunately for Zakk, when he realized that he hadn't played it, he wasn't too pleased. But we made up, and he's all good now. And as I said, I'm just a massive Zakk Wylde fan as a player. I mean, he's incredible. But, it was an interesting album to make. It really was, because there were songwriters from all over the place. We had Mick Jones wrote Dreamer, which is one of Ozzy's biggest songs now on Spotify. And, Mick Jones from Foreigner wrote that song with Ozzy, and I love that song. And, it was just a really challenging record to make, but I enjoyed it very much.
And did Ozzy come around during the recording process?
Oh,
did
yeah.
he get invested? I mean,
Yeah,
not
he did.
come around like he showed up to the studio, but did he like sort of turn a corner and start to get excited about the record?
He did. And he would he would just turn up, though, as you originally said. He would turn up, we'd be cutting a track, and he'd say, oh, where's the middle, mate? Where's the middle section? And I'd say, we've run through this, Ozzy, there isn't a middle section. And he's like, well, I need a middle section. So I'd have to say, okay, stop, right. And I'd literally run out with the band, and we'd say, we need a middle section. Come on, let's work on this. And we would quickly work on something with Ozzy. But it was really like that. You're flying by the seat of your pants, but it was great. It was really fun.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, it was really good.
All right. You've made a bunch of records with The Mission, which is a lesser known band, but do you want to talk about them a little bit? Because you're obviously a big fan as well, right?
I am. I mean, Wayne and I are working on a project at the minute, actually, because he's trying to raise money for the National Health Service in the UK. So one of the biggest songs The Mission had was a song called Tower of Strength, which I didn't produce.
Never liked that song.
And I hated that one. No, John Paul Jones produced that. And
he's all right.
We're gathering, yeah, he's okay. We're gathering together various different musicians that Wayne knows, and obviously some great ones going to be involved, and we're going to do that at the minute. But I worked on The Mission's last album a couple of years ago with Wayne, and I don't know. It's just they were the first people who I really felt like I was joining that band and I was part of it, and we were at Ridge Farm together, and this was the sort of music that I wanted to make, guitar music. And and it was just a wonderful experience for me. I mean, I went through. I mean, it was pretty crazy times, as you can imagine. I remember the first day down at Ridge Farm. I turned up and we recorded, and it got to 11, and one of them said, "Do you want a line of this, mate?" And there was a big line of Speed on the console, and I'm like, "I think I'll skip it," you know. No, I'm going to head to bed soon. So I headed to bed at about 12. And the next morning, I got up. I'd slept at Ridge Farm, came down, and as I walked down the stairs, I could hear acoustic guitars playing, and I thought, "Oh, great, they're up. They're ready to
Yeah.
record." And then I realized, no, they're not. They're not up. They haven't gone
They
to
haven't
bed
gone to
yet.
bed.
So I said, "Lads, you got to go to bed." And they went, "All right, Tim, no problem." So they went to bed, and they turn up at about 5, have some breakfast, and we head to the studio. And I'm looking at this studio thinking, "Oh my God." So it gets to like 10, 11, and they said, do you fancy?" And I thought, "I'm never going to finish this record. It's never going to happen." So so that was that. And we worked, and we got the record done in 2 weeks. But you know what? Sometimes you have to join the band, literally.
Yeah, well,
Those were the days.
yeah.
We would
So
never have got that record done.
So at one point though, and maybe this isn't really true because I mean people's careers sort of shift tracks just naturally, but did you ever make a decision to mix more, or was it just those were the gigs that were coming in? Because you seem to sort of hit a patch where you were mixing a lot more than producing. And I
That's
don't
right.
and
Yeah.
different people it happens to in different ways. I'm just curious how that happened for you and if you were happy with it at the time. And
Yeah, I'm just trying to think when that first happened. I mean, I started to mix a lot. Obviously the Pearl Jam was probably the first one. Um, I mean, back when I made records, and the mixing was just part of the gig. You didn't ever have a mixer.
yeah.
The first person I remember who really made that was Tom. Tom Lord Alge became, to me, was the first person who people were bringing in to have a fresh perspective and become a mixer. And a funny story actually was when I was working on Now and Then You'll Like This. This is amusing. I don't know whether Tom finds it amusing or not, but the we were the label in America said we need a remix done of the single. So Bill Kirbishley, who managed Robert, said they want a remix done of the single. Why do they need that? And I said, well, we made it as an album track. They want a single mix. It makes sense. And he said, well, can't you do it? And I said, well, I could, but And he said, well, just do it on Sunday. So I said, all right. So I went in and I did a single mix on the Sunday. And little did I know, but he sent it back to the label and wrote Tom Lord Alge's mix of the song. And knowing, and not being too hard on A&R guys, but of course they saw the name and they were happy. And, so when Robert released it, it said mixed by Tim Lord Palmer. And that was my only
I've
Lord
seen the
Palmer.
credit. I didn't know where that came from.
That's where it came from. But
That's
yeah,
amazing.
it's funny. But yeah, mixing, it's become a completely separate job. And I think it's also, I mean, I was able to sort of make that, my career has been fortunate to have one life as an analog guy and be happy in that world, and then suddenly be forced into the Pro Tools world. And at first being freaked out by it. I don't want to see it. I remember going to Westlake Audio and them doing a presentation and walking out and going, this is not for me. And then slowly realizing if I don't figure this out, I have no career. So the second half of my career has been in the Pro Tools world and loving it, by the way, and realizing just how incredibly creative it is now. And recently I found that, especially the projects that I do, there's something that I like to call predixing. And it's not mixing anymore now, as we traditionally thought of it, because mixing for us, you were very careful about what you were doing with a mix at the beginning part of my career, because a producer had spent weeks with probably an unlimited budget and a band, and they'd made decisions that you should be pretty respectful of and thoughtful of. So when you mixed it, you were sort of more of a balance guy, really. And someone who was supposed to make it sound better if you could. But now, because of the way music is made, the artists themselves don't have the money to spend because there's no budgets, there's no artist development. And they also don't have access to the studios that we used to have and the microphones that we had and the experience. So I find now a lot of the stuff that I'm sent, I look at it and I try and be the producer at the end of the chain as such. And I'll say, okay, I'll do this, but I'm going to add some stuff for you if that's okay. And most people don't have a problem, because if they don't like it, you can always mute it.
Yeah.
So they've
Yeah.
got nothing to lose, right? And, it may be, I love the guitar in the second verse. It would be great doubled by, a Leslie guitar coming in. So I'll have my Kemper set up here. I'll put a guitar on. I might edit something in the arrangement. I might tune something if it needs it, although I'm very wary of that sort of stuff. But basically taking the thing to the next level, which is not mixing, it's way more than that. Adding new parts and adding high strings or whatever to a chorus, just to give it that elevation. But basically helping the story, open and be as successful as possible. And that to me now is my job. That's what it's become.
And even without the overdubbing, there's so many decisions that you do have to make as a mixer these days.
Oh
that
God, yeah.
You're in that. And it's not to denigrate the people making the records. They either
No.
don't know, or it's just not how it's done now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not how you do it. So
Mm-hmm.
there you go.
It is hard when you open up a song to mix, and you've pretty much got a full day going through it before you can even begin, because it's all very well recording a guitar with 5 different microphones, because we just thought we'd leave it to you at the mix. You can choose, but I mean that takes time,
Yeah, or you don't choose and just bounce it however it comes to you. That's
Well,
that's
some
usually the
people
way I
might.
do, because it's the way they've been listening to it for 8 months.
But that's
so,
why I'm so terrible at my efficiency level with mixing. I swear to God, I spend 2 to 3 days mixing a song these days.
Right.
I just can't get through it quickly like I used to. But then, having your own studio is the most freeing thing that ever happened to me, because we're no longer slaves to the recording studio in the sense of budgets.
Yeah.
I mean, I must have spent the first half of my career working every day apart from Sunday, because I couldn't bring myself for the band to be charged $2,000 for me to take a day off on Saturday.
Yeah.
It just felt wrong to me, that. But now it's great. I'm soundproofed in this little room here. My kids are fast asleep. If I wake up, and because I'm getting older, I wake up at 5 a.m, I'll start mixing, and I might have half a song done or parts of it done before they even wake up. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, I for me, first thing in the morning is definitely very productive. And when you're working at another studio, that's difficult to do, to get there early. It's just not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
So you set up your own mix room in LA, is that right?
I did, yeah.
When you first moved to LA, obviously you didn't just go there to build a studio.
No.
So was this just kind of a natural progression? And was it because you were sick of spending budgets in other people's studios, or you just wanted to have a room that was exactly what you wanted for mixing? Was it after you'd already started to transition a little bit off tape? Just tell us a little bit about what that studio was and why you built it, and what you did there, basically.
Well, I built it because, once labels started to come to me with something called the Mix Fund, to get a song done, it was a massive conflict of interest straight away, because I used to work a lot at Paramount, and I loved working in Paramount C on the big console and that. And I would ask for, and suddenly you have to become like sorting out a deal. All right, yeah, how much can you give me Studio A for? And I hated doing all that stuff in the first place. But
right,
you'd work on a song, you'd spend the day on it, you think, okay, I've got this much money for the studio, I've rented in this much gear, I'll probably end up with this much money. And then you get to the end of the first day and you think, I need another day, really, because I need to do this, 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 and this. But if you do that, you'll end up making no money.
yeah,
And that's no way. That's no good. So at that point, it was like, okay, well, obviously, I understand now why people have their own studios, because you take the money, you spend as long as you like on it, and you don't compromise. You make it great. So it was literally born out of that. And the first studio I built was, well, I didn't really build. It was actually Ray Parker Jr.'s old room at the American Studios in the Valley, and it was a big blue velvet room. It was great, and I just put my Tone Lux, because I purchased a Tone Lux setup, so it's very much a hybrid. So I'm mixing in the box, but I'm still using little bits and bobs. And I worked out of there for a while, and then I got to the next level where I thought, why am I paying this money every month in rent when I could have my own studio in my home? And living in Studio City for all those years, I was ready to try something new. My kids from my second marriage were the schools were becoming more of an issue. And I thought, okay, let's try somewhere new. So we looked around, and I've been to Austin through South by, came to Texas, and I built my own studio from scratch. And I haven't looked back. And I really love having my own studio now. In fact, it scares me to go outside because, you think of the day, you think of the times you go, oh, you're mixing this week at Record Plant, and then next week you're at Larrabee, and your brain is supposed to remember every acoustic nuance of those rooms. You bring your Genelec 1031As or whatever, like I used to, but still, when you have your own room, you walk in straight away, you're like, I know, take that out immediately. Get the EQ going. You know what you're doing with the EQ straight away, and there's no guesswork involved. So it's been a wonderful thing for me, and I'm very grateful to have this little room.
It's great. And so when you moved to Austin, did you feel like, I mean, because you'd been in London and LA, so the two epicenters of the gigantic music business, did you feel, well, how was it for you to get out of there? And just because I have my own thoughts about it, having done sort of the same thing into the countryside here, but I'm curious how it felt to you and whether you were trying to get away from it, or it's like the decision to go to Austin was based more on family things, and then it turned out that it was a certain way for you. Or I'm going to stop talking now and you'll start.
Well, no, I think it was a bit of everything, really. I mean, I think in any marriage, I think when you start to know the layout of your supermarket and all the restaurants in your area and the way the city is, maybe it's time to go somewhere else to challenge yourself. And we literally we had a mover van, and we packed our stuff up into our little minivan, and we drove across from LA to Texas. And that was a very exciting time for my family. And starting again in a new place was really fun, finding out how it worked. And also it opened up a lot of opportunities for me. But at the same time, because of the internet, didn't close down too many either. So It wasn't like if I'd done that in the 1970s, it might have been a whole different thing. But I'm still, the majority of my work, I mix a lot for bands, like I've just finished the new EP from Villa Vallo from Finland. So I'm working with bands from Finland, I'm working with bands from London. It's all through the internet. So it really doesn't matter whether I'm in Texas or in LA anymore, thank God. I kept my 323 number, but still, I mean, I've really enjoyed the transition. And also for me, in LA, because it was such a vast pool of people, to come to Texas was nice because that's where I began to get more involved in the Recording Academy, because I was able to, and currently serving as trustee has been wonderful. And one of the things that I think are one of the saddest parts of what we do for a living, or particularly for me anyway, as a mixer on my own, is that I loved meeting up with people and spending time with artists, and that's gone. And, being able to look someone in the eye and try and figure out, or as Larry would say with his eyes, when he does that thing, it's on Curb Your Enthusiasm. When you're trying to figure out what someone's thinking, that was part of our job. And when you're working on your own, that's not needed. So getting involved and being able to be part of the academy and coming to LA and meeting up with music makers again and talking with them, it's been great because it keeps that sort of social scene going as well, which I love.
So we're, of course, as always, running out of time-ish. I mean, if you don't have anywhere to go, we can keep going for a bit, if that's all right. But there's a few things I want to talk about. So I want to talk about one thing that's a bit more recent, and then we're going to go back and talk about some specific stuff that we've kind of glossed over. But over the last several years, you've been mixing some records for Larry Klein.
Yes.
You saying Larry made me remember, oh my God, we got to talk about this too. That's a very different genre again for you. I mean, because he's not only doing jazz records, but it's based in that world, very natural recordings, very open records, that sort of instrumentation. And I'm just curious how that started and how it's working out, and your thoughts about it, because it's just a very different thing.
It is, and so wonderful for me because through my career, as you've seen, whether it's going from Sepultura to Tears for Fears, or whoever. I don't just like one type of music, and never wanted to just do one type of music. And through my manager Sandy, he introduced me to Larry, and I was just very fortunate, as once again a timing thing. And Larry was looking for somebody to work with, and I have had the opportunity to mix a lot of his records. And working with Larry's probably one of the few producers that I work with, so I really go back into a different mode when I'm working with Larry. I am making a record for Larry in the traditional sense of an engineer and a producer.
Right.
I am the mixer, but at the same time, if Larry says I don't like that, I take it off. Whereas most of the time I'm working with an artist directly, and I'm mixing for the artist by this point. So Larry's like a traditional producer engineer setup, and it's very challenging because, as you said, it's more sparse. I rely on using my faders a lot more, and it's a much more organic process. I mean, Larry will often go as far as to print the plates at the Village, because he has a certain sound.
Yeah.
And when he sends his comments, I'm always very respectful of them, and they make a lot of sense. They're very musical, and I've been given the opportunity to work with music that I never would have done before. I mean, to work with Billy Childs or Candice Springs, things like that, and his wife Luciana. I mean, it's just great for me, and it's so sparse, and the choice of reverbs and how things sit together is so important. And yeah, it has been a wonderful experience for me to work with Larry.
Right. Great. Yeah, he's it's so talented, and as you say, it's all very musical. It's all it's about. It's never, I really wanted this to be bright. It's just, it's
Yeah, no,
musical
not at
and
all.
what's
Yeah,
important.
I must say that I definitely approach mixing for Larry in a very different way to mixing other things. It is
And
more organic.
do you ever find yourself while you're mixing something else thinking, "Oh, hold on a second. Now, how would I do this if I were doing it for Larry?" Because it is such a different mindset, just to force yourself to think about it differently. Or does that go away when you're not working with him?
Well, yeah, it's funny you say that, because sometimes I think, you have an honest gut feeling, I'd like to try this, and I'll send something to Larry with a distortion all over a piano or something, and I'll think he's not going to like it. And Larry will be like, I love that. I want that. That's great. So he never stifles the creativity. I'm just aware of his sort of sensibility to what I think how he likes records to sound.
Right.
That's what it is. I mean, we worked. I got to meet Ed Journey through the Academy, and we lost Ed, and Ed and I. The last two records Ed made, I think, was Jeff Goldblum's record and Luciana Souza's album, and I mixed both of those. And it's I just get to work with some amazing people through this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So now skipping back to a very small Irish band that we glossed over.
Have you
Let's
got
just talk
another
about
hour?
you two. Go on.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you something funny, and this is, I think, also something that may be useful to younger engineers, is the idea of taking a chance, and because sometimes when you're mixing, you think, I can't possibly do that, and then you think, well, I guess I'll try it, but it's dangerous because you don't know what the artist is going to feel. And so the first opportunity I had to work with U2 came about because I'd worked with Michael Hutchence after Michael had died on the Michael Hutchence solo record. I was working with Andy Gill, and Sandy, and this is very funny actually. Sandy, of course, a manager with a master plan. Sandy said, "I've got these mixes for you to do on the Michael Hutchence record," and I said, "Oh, great, that's great." "And you're going to work with Andy Gill?" And I said, "Great." And Sandy said, "You do a great job. Bono's on one of the songs. He's going to love the mix, and you'll work on the new U2 record." And I was like, "Yeah, right. Okay, Sandy, thanks a lot, mate." But actually, it sort of came true. So we worked on the Michael Hutchence album, and Bono rang up and he said, "I love what you did to this song. Would you do some more mixing for me?" And I was, "Of course, absolutely." And the first song I was going to mix was a song from a movie they were working on called, there's a song called The Ground Beneath Her Feet. I don't know if you know that one.
Mm.
It's from the $1 Million Hotel, and it's one of my favorite songs I mixed for U2. And Daniel Lanois plays the most beautiful pedal steel. And anyway, so I'm heading to the studio, no band, heading to the studio. I was working at Olympic, and I get a phone call on my cell phone from Bono, who I had never met. And excuse my terrible Irish accent, but he calls me up and he says, we don't like the drums. I said, sorry? He said, we don't really like the drums on that one. So I didn't want to sound confused, of course. So I was like, oh, yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'll figure it out. No problem. And he said, thanks very much, like that. And it was fairly cryptic. But so I opened up the session and I sort of thought to myself, okay, well, I reckon he doesn't like the program drums at the beginning of the song, because the song starts with the program and at the end of the song, Larry comes in and it's full on U2. But at the beginning, there's a lot of programming. So I figured that's what he's not happy with. And I thought, well, how am I going to fix that? And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll take it out and I will play brushes like Walk on the Wild Side. So I rented in a snare drum and some cymbals, and I just did, the thing, and created a loop, got that going, put some cymbals on. And I thought, oh, wow, I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing here. Larry might fucking freak, it might not work. But I'll go for it. And I spent a long time on that mix, and we had some problems with the console. And I sent it to them, and they loved it. And that's the lesson is, sometimes you think I can't possibly do that, but maybe you can. Maybe it's okay.
And I love that you weren't quite sure, but good choice to think it's the program drums and not Larry. Because I'd imagine if you thought it was the other way around, that could have been trouble.
That wouldn't have been good. But so then after that, because that was from there, then I was asked to come to Dublin, and we worked on Elevation, and we worked on New York, and I worked on Stuck in a Moment. Stuck in a Moment was another interesting one. I started a lot of these songs in LA before I went to Dublin. And it was quite surprising, to me, the way that things were presented. With Stuck in a Moment, they recorded the drums as a mono track. Now, I think that's fine, if you're going for a vibe, go for a vibe. But why not, while you're at it, in this day and age, print some stuff anyway, just hide it. But there wasn't anything hidden. So it was the mono track to get on with. And so I fired kick drum, fired a snare drum, played shakers, played tambourines, did all this stuff. And once again, I was worried that, that might be transgressing the unwritten law as such, especially with U2. But the thing about U2, which is amazing, is they are very, very open-minded, and they work with so many people.
Yeah.
They literally will listen to something someone's done and say, I really like the way that feels in the middle eight. Let's just keep that bit and move on. I mean, they're constantly gathering information from people that they want to work with. And, working in Dublin was for me, I was a bit starstruck by the whole dinner. We'd sit around, there was literally a round table, King Arthur style. We had a round table, and you'd sit at dinner and you'd have Larry and The Edge and Bono and Adam, and then Brian Eno's there, and Daniel Lanois there, and Mike Hedges is just there, and Eno's there, and Steve Lillywhite's there, and we're all just sitting chatting about songs, and it was mind blowing for me, because these were all my heroes, and it was very funny indeed, but very long time to get things right. A lot of second guessing, in my opinion, but that's the way they work. They're the hardest working band I've ever known. It's you have to have a lot of patience, that's for sure.
I only worked on a couple songs with them, but yeah, it was, and what was amazing too is like going back to the song that had the mono drums and you put a bunch of stuff on. With some bands, you could think, well, maybe they just didn't even remember what they had at that point, and so they think like they've been hearing it in mono, but there was other stuff. They know exactly what's there. Edge remembers every note he has ever played.
That's
everything.
It's amazing, isn't he? He had that. You obviously know he had that he'd come in with a bag of cassettes, and Edge would be like, I call him Edge, brain the size of a planet, and he would literally go into a cassette and say, "Hang on a minute, I think I remember a little part I did in that middle on." Play this cassette here, and he'd dig out a cassette from his bag, and there would be the version, and it would be there. Yeah. He was incredible.
And then his guitar tech would know exactly what guitar with what strings through what pedals and what amp with what settings he played it.
Dallas, right? Yeah,
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 yeah.
amazing.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very, very meticulous. So, all right, I want to talk about an obscure one now, only
Okay.
because it's an album that I absolutely love. And I actually did a test mix, did not get the gig, which it turns out is a fine thing. Idiot Pilot. Do you
Oh,
even remember that album, Wolves?
well, yeah, I do.
Ross
Yeah,
Robinson produced, and I just had heard something off the first record, I think, and through my I can't even remember exactly how I managed to get a chance to mix Elephant, which is my favorite song on that record. I think it's the second track. And they were just a fantastic band. And I think in a way they felt punk to me because they were doing a little bit of like what 21 Pilots have exploded with now, but this
absolutely.
has got to be 12 years ago or something, right?
You're right. You're right. Yeah, that was an interesting project. In fact, I bumped into those guys at South by Southwest a couple of years ago. They were like wheeling, as everyone does at South by,
Yeah.
wheeling in cabinets into a show somewhere. And they're
All
hey,
right.
boom, like that. I said, oh, hi, how's that? And they go, we're Idiot Pilot. Remember us? I said, oh, yeah, I do. But yeah, I did that. I mixed that record at Paramount, I think. And yeah, it was quite complex and it was quite detailed to get right. And they definitely had a vision.
Yeah.
And then Ross would come down and he sort of he was definitely of the mindset of like, well, let's just keep going all night. And I don't think I was up to his pirate level as much as he was at that time. I'd say, oh, let's just come in tomorrow and finish it then. But yeah, that was a really interesting record. I'd actually forgotten about that one.
Well, I think everybody who's watching this should at least listen to track 2. Listen to Elephant and see what you think. I think it's just a gigantic track. Just
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's funny, isn't it? How I made a playlist the other day of songs that I've absolutely loved that didn't really happen, and or at least didn't happen to the level that I felt that they should. And doing it for so long, I can make a pretty good, pretty decent playlist. But bands like Hours, I thought Hours were going to be a
yes,
huge
yes,
band. I love
absolutely. I
Jimmy.
listened to Distorted Lullabies again today after I was
Yeah,
seeing it on your discography. It's a great record.
so many great artists that slip through the net. But even with that, I still preferred the music industry that way. My friend Brian McLeod, the drummer, said the other day, I preferred the music industry when it was run by the mob and it was full of payola. And it's sort of funny because it's sort of true in the sense that, I think people need that filter. And I think that what we had before at least meant that if you created a song or a piece of art, however you like to describe it, people were given the opportunity to hear it more than once,
Yeah.
maybe 10 or 15 times. And like food, sometimes you go, oh, I don't like this, and then on your 15th taste you say, I absolutely love this particular type of food now. And music's like that. And we had that in our generation because we'd spend all our money on an album and you'd be fucked if you're not going to listen to that whole thing.
Oh yeah,
You'd listen to it over
absolutely,
and over again.
absolutely.
And radio did that for us because, you go and you say, oh my God, I heard this song on the radio. I didn't think it was that good. And then by the end of the first week, you're like, I love that song. And if it
And
wasn't for the power of radio, that wouldn't have happened. And we've sort of lost that in a way.
and that goes back to Pearl Jam being allowed to make a sea change because it is difficult the first time you hear something you're not used to. You
Yeah.
kind of like, what the hell was that? But
Yeah.
as you get used to it, then you can actually listen to it and assess it. Would you send me that playlist? Because I think we should post a link to it because that's
Yeah. Sure.
exactly, I mean, we have an inspiration playlist and a perspiration playlist for you. So the 10 tracks that you
Okay.
love that you didn't work on, 10 tracks you love that you did.
Love
But
to.
I love the idea of stuff you've done that didn't quite go as far as you think it should have and that people should be
Yeah.
aware of. I think that'd be
Yeah.
great. So look, I could ask you about so many other records, but I think we should get to some questions because people
Okay.
have been watching the whole time. So Mark has texted me that he is technically able to come back in and ask us questions. And if he
Okay.
isn't, then he'll text us. But just while we're waiting for Mark to come on, we could have talked about Concrete Blonde or Lang Lang or Polyphonic Spree or Tears for Fears we barely even talked about. But anyway, we'll let Mark ask some questions.
Hello.
Hi, Mark. We
All
can't hear
right.
you, unfortunately.
Oh, you're
Hold
going
on.
to text it, isn't it?
How
No.
about now? How's that?
Ah,
Oh, we
perfect.
can hear
There
you.
you are.
All right,
Yeah.
great.
Hi.
Cool.
I'm hot.
Guys, this has been incredible. This is so fun. The stories are just amazing, and so many of these records are in like my earliest CD collection. So thank you for doing this, Tim.
He's just trying to say you're old, Tim, but I don't take
Yeah,
that shit from him.
don't do that.
Well, I mean, I'm young.
You are young.
No. Okay, so
I
our
gotta bring
top
Squid in for this portion.
Squid is getting some love in the chat room, by the way. He
Oh,
keeps
good.
walking by.
Good.
So.
I'm gonna get
Yes.
Oh, here comes Teddy. Here comes Teddy. All right, perfect.
Nice. All right, Squid and Teddy.
Let's fire away.
Okay, this question's actually for Teddy. How do you stay sane and keep good judgment after listening to a tune hundreds of times? From Rocky
Well,
Levine.
I think a couple of things about that. One of the wonderful things about being able to work at home is that you can actually stop, walk away, watch a movie, do something else, and then return. The perspective you get by doing that is just, priceless. In the old days, we couldn't do that. You're paying for a studio at $1,000 a day or more, and we needed to keep working. But now you can, go and do something else and that'll really, really help. Secondly, is to listen to it on, not, change your monitors. Listen on the small ones for an hour. Listen on your headphones for a while, and then the big one of them all is switch the monitor off and listen, because I like to call it the Stevie Wonder effect, because I worked with Stevie, fortunately, when it was my first day in the studio, and I walked in and I had to make tea for Stevie, and he was just such an inspirational guy for me to meet so early in my career. And if you can't see it, you hear it with so much more intensity, and by not looking at the waveforms as they go by, I think you get a fresh perspective, and I think you should do that.
That's a great answer. Awesome. Okay, so this next question upvoted was from Toby, and Toby says, here's a question for both the gentlemen. What's one piece of equipment that you've used for a while, only to realize one day how crazy and over the top it really is?
Andrew, you can go first while I think about that.
God, I don't know. Well, for years, and I still do, though I'm using it a bit less, I've had this thing called the rear bus because of the Neve, and I had a quad bus. So I had a stereo parallel compressor that was everything except the drums, basically. And I've used it forever. For a long time, that was a Mindprint compressor. It was a single rack space thing from this company called Mindprint. It had a 12AX7 tube. And I would never use it just on something. Like, it wasn't that great. But parallel, it was like, wow, it was working. And it worked for a couple of years. And then I replaced it with a pair of 1176s and never really looked back. But I don't know if that counts. I'm pretty wary about committing to a piece of gear in a way that sonically impacts stuff, because I think, like we were talking about before, you need to hear something a bunch of times before you even necessarily like it. I don't ever put up a piece of gear and go, oh my God, it's the best thing ever. It always is like, what the hell just happened? And I ease my way in anyway.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with Andrew. I think every project, every song that you do, you sort of approach it. You have your things that you go to, but there's nothing that springs to mind that is crazy that I do. Maybe Parallel Particles, that Scheps one, that's a bit weird. No, I like that. I actually use that all the time on my drum bus, actually. But no, there's no. As I said, I think when you're playing to the strengths of the material, you sort of have an armory of stuff that you go to for different types of things that you're trying to achieve. And I don't have any things that I think are excessive that I just use every time that I would rather not.
Cool. All right. Next question is from Patrick, and Patrick says, thank you both. Tim, could you speak about the killer heavy distortion tones of Porcupine Trees in Absentia? Says they're so tight and not flabby. What is Steven's tone coming out of the amp was it Steven's tone coming out of the amp that way? And then he's wondering how much of that was done in the mix versus in the tracking.
Well, the Porcupine Tree album was one of those situations where it was, in fact, very well recorded. I would like to take credit for it being a sonic masterpiece because of what I've done, but it really isn't. And the mixing was very enjoyable. And when you're working with great recordings, it's, as you know, it's quite simple. At that point, I was probably using, trying to think what distortion pedals I'd be using at that time, amp farms and things like that. And you control them, you're dialing them in accordingly to where they're fitting in musically and where they are tonally. So they're very much done by ear according to what you're trying to achieve on that song, on each individual song. But that album, I was tending to use Echo Farm a lot for all the spin stuff and things like that. But Stephen was a big Tears for Fears fan. That's how I ended up, I think, getting the gig. And he knew what he wanted to achieve. And as I said, it was very well recorded. And we were recording we were mixing on an SSL, on a J series SSL, which sounds beautiful anyway, at Larrabee. And I don't have anything negative to say about that experience at all. It was great, and it's just following the song. The song will tell you where to go,
Yeah.
So just while we're talking about guitars, really quickly behind you, I don't want models, whatever, but before we went live, you were saying that those guitars have all been given to you by different people. You want to just take us very quickly through them? Because
sure.
That's a good list too.
That was from Johnny from the Goo Goo Dolls. That's a Gretsch. I love that one. This one, that Telecaster was from The Edge. And what happened in the 90s and in the 2000s, after finishing album projects, I'm sure you did the same. If bands were doing like the Letterman show or something like that, I'd always say, no, I'll come and sit in the sound room, basically because I love to go. I wanted to be a part of it because I loved it. And I wasn't going to charge any money for it because it's such fun, So I would sit with the TV sound guys and just make sure the balance was good going out to the broadcast. And I did that for U2 for ages. I did Letterman, I did K-Rock, and then I did the Oscars, which was insane. I had the most insane experience one night at the Oscars with U2. And anyway, one day Edge sent me that and said, thanks for all the help that you've given us on the TV show. So that was really sweet. Wow. And it's a great pride to me. And then underneath that is a Les Paul, which was when I was working with Tin Machine. David Bowie had a deal with Les Paul, and he managed to get me a black Les Paul, and Reeves brought it over to me in London and said, this is from David's Les Paul deal, which was great. And then I have a Kalamazoo, like a 1930s Kalamazoo in the middle, where you can't really see it. But Vila Vallo from him gave me that at the end of the him recordings. And there's a signature Schecter electric 12-string there, from which is the Wayne Hussey electric 12-string Schecter, which I love. And Michael from Schecter has been very kind to me over the years. So we could go on forever. I don't want to bore you.
So no one's ever given you a bass, though. You skipped right over the basses.
There's a bass. That's from
but was that given to you?
Yeah, it was given to me by Mige from him.
All right, perfect. Good.
Him were a band from Finland that I worked with a lot, and I did about 4 albums with them. And they were the first Finnish band ever to have a gold album in America. And they're such a great band.
Excellent. All right, good. Sorry, Mark, I hijacked you.
All right. Let's see. So Jesse F. Miller says, Tim, thanks for doing this. When tracking rock bands, do you prefer to get a live off the floor vibe take and then do punch-ins, or just capture the drums and layer everybody else into the track? Could you discuss the pros and cons of each?
Well, the pros and cons of each are most definitely the artists themselves and the players themselves. Some players, I've done albums like, I did a record with a band called Burning Tree, I remember. Mark Ford went on to be in the Black Crowes, and they were just like the most insane 3-piece. And we tracked it all, and you didn't need to do anything else. You just had to try and capture their sound. Other bands you work with, you try and do that, and you immediately realize, well, this isn't really going to work the way that we want it to. So you diplomatically, as your producer, have to come up with the idea of, look, let's get the drums down and let's build it up so that we can monitor the way that we build up the overdubs and really, painstakingly go through it. But it really does it's determined by the players themselves. And it also is determined by the vision for the project itself. If you are going for that sort of live performance, then obviously if you can capture it, then you're halfway there.
So let me ask you a little follow up to that, because this has come up with different people, but it's come up a few times now. Has there been a record where heading into it you said, "Man, I know exactly what kind of record we're going to make. I've got a vision for this band, for this record," and you go in and the band is on board and you end up making a totally different record because that's what just happened in the studio?
I think that probably happened more than once. Actually.
Right.
We all have great ideas, right? Illusions of grandeur. But one particular one, I was working with the guys from Flesh for Lulu. They'd formed a new band called Gigantic, and they're a great rock and roll band. And I just wanted to capture it. I just thought it was going to be great. And we were working in the Valley, and we set it all up. And like you said, it just wasn't the way it was going to work. And once we separated things and Al had put his drum tracks on, we were able to get a better live sound and a better excitement by doing things separately than we could have done trying to get it together. So, you know, it wasn't really what I originally intended, but it worked out in the end for the better.
Right.
Awesome. Here's a question from some guy named Puremix Live. No idea who this is.
Oh yeah.
That person, whoever it is, asks, did you have any references when you were mixing Pearl Jam's 10? And were there any records specifically that were inspiring both you and the band at the time?
No, I'd say absolutely not. There was nothing as a blueprint for that record whatsoever. Our history together working with Mother Love Bone was there. They knew what the records that I'd made before, and they were a brand new band. That was the most important thing to remember, is that they were quite shy and quiet because they were an unknown band at that particular moment. And I'd already sort of had my career fairly established. And Eddie was a big David Bowie fan, I remember that. And I used to sit and play him little outtakes from Tin Machine of stuff that we'd done. And I remember him asking me if he could take a tape away. And I said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And I think he was a little bit disappointed, to be honest. But I think now that he's the big star that he is, he would probably be glad if people treat his little recordings that way. But no, we didn't ever reference any other music. And certainly we weren't referencing the Seattle sound because it hadn't really been determined at that point, which is why, as I said, that we weren't shy of the reverbs, and we weren't shy of delay, and we weren't shy of just being as creative as possible, because this was a live band recorded. Let's make it sound as colorful and make the story unfold as best as it can do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know what to get Eddie for his birthday now.
Yeah, right.
Tim, if you guys had any inkling of how big that record would have been, do you think that you would have been so experimental with that stuff, or would it have changed anything about that process?
Well, I think, of course, when you work on the second record when you work on the follow-up album after a huge one, people start second guessing, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. The beauty of that record is that there wasn't any second guessing. It was a pleasure, and it was very instinctive. The music led the way, and the choices that were made were not made by, oh, we should be doing this or we should be doing that. There was none of that. And the band would come in every morning and say, maybe we could just try this and that and the other, and we'd make a few changes, and we were done. It was really very simple. And I find that, the music's going to tell you, and pontificating and overthinking things is, music, rock and roll music, and decisions made by committee have never been great. One vision is a lot better, because then you just end up watering down an idea. It's much better to have one vision. And I guess I was lucky in a way that they were very open-minded to what I wanted to do.
Right.
So to take that a step further, do you find just within bands, when there are multiple visions, that will destroy a record? Do you prefer to have, because no band is all on the same page with exactly how a record's going to be, but some of them are really good about deferring and some of them are not. And do you think that there have been times where just to make the band happy, you've just ended up compromising and not really as happy with the result as you think you would have been if one person was a stronger voice?
I think that can happen, but I think that's where, as a producer, you need to sometimes stand your ground. And I don't mean that in an obnoxious way. I mean, respect, I've always felt, has to be earned. It doesn't come automatically. if you have a relationship with an artist just because you've worked on this record or that record. That doesn't mean anything. They have to respect that you are doing the right thing for them, and you have to prove that to them. But once you get that, I think you should be unafraid to say, look guys, this is really good. You're going to have to trust me on this if you can. But having one vision in a band, when you have a leader, it does make it easier. There's no doubt. Once it starts flip-flapping around a band, I remember there was a rule in the 90s when I would say to bands, you can only comment on the mix if you don't comment about your own instrument. And that was always quite good, because they'd be like, oh, I don't really know what to say now.
Okay,
turn everyone except me down. Yeah, that's it.
Right.
Yeah.
Clever. Okay, so let's see. This one sounds like it's from a friend. So Travis Kennedy Sound says to tell the story of the tape masters flying around the room and putting it all back together.
Oh, okay. So as an assistant, one of the duties you have at the end of an album is you have to compile. This is the old days. You had to compile for mastering all the master takes onto the spools. Okay, because the mastering engineer has to be able to hit play at the beginning of the record and all the songs flow through. And of course, that meant putting this tape on, spooling that on, take that tape off, get the next song, do this. And often, if you weren't careful and you balanced your reels wrong, you could end up having too much on one reel and not enough on another. So I was building up the Bananarama album, and I chopped together the first 3 or 4 songs, and there was a long way to get to the third song on this particular reel. So I span it forward, and I looked over at the right-hand reel and realized that it had gone too far, and freaked and panicked and hit stop, and the tape went flying into the air and was all over. So I panicked, and I knew the producer was in the other room. So I put the recording light on in the studio, and I literally had to untangle the tape and cut it in about 8 places, and I wound it round and round the console and wound it slowly back on, and had to do edits back together in places that would never have been musical. They would never have been part of it. Oh. So when we finally went to master, the producer was standing next to me, and as the songs were going through, every so often he'd hear the edits go, and he'd say, I don't remember editing halfway through the middle 8 on that song. And I'd say, oh yeah, we definitely did. Remember, we pushed up the... But I managed to get through that one, thank God.
Amazing.
Tape.
Tape,
yes.
Right?
Well, I think we've gone through all of the submitted ones.
Well, fantastic.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, people are very, very happy in the chat room and everything, and thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate being on the chat. It was great to talk to Andrew.
Yeah, this is awesome, Tim. Really, really good.
Anytime.
Excellent.
Actually, there is one more. There was some discussion going on while you guys were talking guitars, and a couple people were asking if you guys could talk about tracking and doubling rock guitars. Let's see. So I think they were just wondering different techniques for how you were doing it. So if it was like different tones or same tones on both sides.
Well, all those combinations at work, Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's fantastic to have 2 completely different guitar amps on each side. Other times, if you want it to be more subtle, then obviously, you just want the width, then keep to the same tone and maybe just detune the guitar a little bit. I think every combination of those works. You just have to use your ear, and that's the thing ultimately about any of this stuff that we do, is that with all the tools and everything that we've got, you make the decision through your ears of what it should be like. And at any point you can intervene and go, no, this doesn't work, I need to do this. And now you have so much control, don't ever compromise.
Yeah. I think going back to, the second one of these, I had Joe Barisi on, and he was talking about his approach for tracking guitars. And he has this great sort of concept of the left and right, and that could be multiple guitars, it could be just 2 guitars, could be whatever. And then he's got the enforcer, which is this ghosted triple in the middle that will only be used in certain parts of the song. So you're not adding another performance, because if you put 3 performances of the same thing on one side, it just turns into noise. What's big about it is hearing notes start and stop, and if they don't do it together, that can really actually make it sound smaller. But his ability to just pop, he called it the Clint Eastwood, up the middle a little bit in sections and things like that, gives you the illusion of adding more guitars to the sides when you haven't. So to turn it into an LCR thing.
The other thing that's interesting is that, you know, if you're always thinking about the way the brain is thinking about this stuff, is that, you know, obviously the more information that's going on left and right is distracting to the center. If you've got a vocal and you want the vocal to be heard and the lyric is important, sometimes when you, nowadays with the opportunity to loop things, I often find that I'll leave a performance sloppy in the intro because I want that left and right. I want people to feel that width. But then when the vocal begins, I then paste the loop so that they're more solid, and then your ear is not being distracted, and it sits itself into the back, and suddenly you're conscious of the lead vocal. And then as soon as the re-intro occurs, it becomes a live performance again and gets more crazy. But using that mixture of, you know, a loop and the real performance, you can use that to your advantage in some really interesting ways.
That's great. And I love that you picked up a guitar pick to talk about this.
I didn't even notice. That's great.
Awesome.
I mean, it's all about, it's funny because it's all about, you know, I mean, ultimately at some point you have to just use your ears and say, that's enough, even if it's not great. I mean, there's so much, when we grow up as engineers, we have this feeling that everything has to be great. And sometimes not being great is the way it has to be. And I think we forget that sometimes. And I'll give you one last example. When I was working on the Tin Machine record, there was a song, one of my favorite songs on the first Tin Machine record was called I Can't Read. And I mixed that song as a rough. And David Bowie said, I don't want you to mix it again. And I said, I really want to mix it again because I feel I can make it better. And he said, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. I'll give you 1 hour. And he gave me 1 hour to mix the song. And he said, whatever you got, that's what we're going to use. And it's one of my favorite mixes on that record. And, you know, sometimes having all the time and perfecting and all that, maybe you miss the point. Just get to the point. Always remember what the song is about. What is the determining factor? What is the thing that is appealing about this song?
Well, and I love the concept of, I mean, obviously the technical part of having the loose double guitars going to a tight thing so that you can focus on the vocal, but that is so important. The concept that when the verse starts, you have to focus on the vocal. Nobody cares how great the guitars are in the verse.
Yeah,
nobody.
Absolutely.
And if they do care, you have failed miserably.
Yes, exactly. It's like, what is the point of this point in the song? What am I trying to get? What needs to be heard right here?
Yeah, yeah. So if you have a really good pick scrape in the middle of the verse, fly it to the intro. There you go.
Amazing. One other interesting one just came in. Do you mind one more question?
Oh, God.
Sure.
All right.
It's not from Puremix Live, I promise.
Yeah, right.
It's from Jesse, and you might
Okay.
see why I find it interesting. Hi, what was the vocal mixing chain for 10? Might as well have been from me.
Wow. Well, in those days, as I said, I was really into the idea of different effects. I don't know whether it's a British thing as opposed to American thing. I always found American records tended to have a reverb and it would be like that for the whole song. But for me, when I grew up in the 80s, every section of the song required a different emotion. So it was treated very differently. So I imagine, and I remember, you know, there'd be delays that come on for certain lines that were on faders because it was a neve, and they would disappear in other sections. There's reverbs, throws, as we used to call them, where certain words go deep into the reverb, but others don't. There would be a basic delay that may come off for a middle section. I mean, it was a complex pattern according to what was required from the lyric and the emotion of that song. There was no simple, well, I did this and did that. Obviously, a beautiful sounding Neve console, probably a nice 1176 compressor, I don't remember. And we had echo plates, so we had lots of nice things to work with, but certainly not one thing, an ever-changing thing, as you'll notice on a live or anything. The vocal comes right to the front in the middle, and then it goes back into deep reverb. And I mean, that was what I loved to do, and especially in those days. I was a bit ADHD, I guess.
Amazing. That
Brilliant.
just a comment on that record. That was, as I was telling you, that was one of the first records that got me into production and playing and everything. And I heard the remixes years and years later, and this is after my ears had developed and everything, and I hadn't necessarily listened to 10 in a long time, and hearing the new mixes was really eye-opening for me, because I remembered like how that first version of that record sounded, and when those things weren't there, it wasn't the same for me. And I was like, wait, it's almost like somebody took out a guitar part, and it was those subtle throws and stuff that you did organically in there that really stuck out. And that was the way that that record was imprinted in my head, versus like hearing a new mix. And that was
And
definitely
it's a really big point, actually, because I've been putting together the playlists. I mean, you actually had yours in Spotify to begin with, so I didn't have to go find it. But most people are just sending me an email with lists of songs, and I'm putting these playlists together. And 7 out of the 10, I can't find the original version. It doesn't exist anymore. It's always at least a remaster or something.
Yeah.
There's nothing from the 70s on Spotify that hasn't been remastered.
Yeah, it's bad.
And
isn't
things
it?
that are, the 2011 mix, and you don't even know who did it. And like Ken Scott was making a big deal out of, don't listen to the digital thing. You don't. But in a lot of ways, he's right. And I think at the moment, you could probably get CDs insanely cheap. And I think whatever your favorite records are, it's worth going out and finding a super cheap old version of the record to find out what it was when it began life. Because you cannot find those versions online anymore. And it's a shame that, I mean, if a band wants to update it, fine, more power to them. But to not keep the original available as an alternate is kind of a drag. I mean, it goes all the way back to 80s Queen records and stuff. It's ridiculous.
It's funny because the more you think about it, when you cover, essentially a new version of a song is always like a cover version, and 9 times out of 10 you love the way a song is presented to you that first time, warts and all. Which is why we had a problem as producers in the 80s and 90s, because if a demo had something, you don't just throw that away, because you immediately have an emotional connection to that thing that may be wrong. Even it may be a little bit sharp or flat, but it had some emotion to it, and just by being right didn't make it better. Which is why when you hear a new version of a song, a new mix of a song, a new cover of a song where they get it right, we're not interested in that, because as music fans, we fall in love with something the way it was first presented to us. And that's just one of the great things about the technology we have now is, if I'm producing something and somebody's got a guitar and it's a bit shoddy, but it's got a vibe, I'll say, like, okay, let's try and beat it. Let's go for it. And if we can't beat it, I'm using that one. Thank you very much. And that's it. We didn't have that in those days because we had it on a crappy Tascam cassette. And you'd be desperately trying to get back to a certain vibe that you couldn't get. But now there's no excuses.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and famously, the Stones went back, dumped the cassette onto 2-inch tape, did a couple overdubs, and called it a day because they couldn't beat it. So it's the mindset of understanding what is better. And sonics don't matter. None of that matters.
And Jimmy Iovine is Jimmy Iovine did that a lot in his career. He would be smart, and that's where he's a genius. Is he's like, he spent a lot of money recording it. He'd say, no, we've got to go back to this. This
yeah, but he totally dropped the ball on you, so screw that guy.
Well, one of my favorite quotes from this interview is definitely, and then you redefined it when you were talking about American mixes and the sound of them. It's incredible.
Well, but it's true. It's true. Tim, thank you so much for doing this, especially the extra time. And we barely got to talk about all your work with the Academy, but you did bring it up. If for the people who are in the States, if they don't know, everybody thinks the Recording Academy is just the Grammys, and the Grammy side of it, you can think what you will, whatever. It is peer voted, but it is an awards show. There's lots of money there, but they also have 2 charities that are amazing. If you are a musician and you need help, they will give you money. You don't have to be a member of the Academy, nothing. You just, anything to do with music, you say, I need help, I don't have a place to live, I need to get off drugs, I need food, whatever, and they will help you. And I know that's been a big part of why you've gotten so involved. So
that's correct.
Good on you.
Thank you for saying that. And yeah, advocacy and Music Cares are the things that draw you in. Like you said, the award show, when you have an award show that tries to be based on excellence rather than popularity, it's always going to get a bit of difficulty because it's so subjective. But the heart is in the right place, and Music Cares and advocacy are important to everyone, and that's why I do it.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank you.
All right. And on that note, I think we'll leave it there.
It's great. All right, everybody, tune in tomorrow. We're
Yes.
back. Cheers. We're back tomorrow with Vance Powell, Reed Shippen for Between Two Beards. And their guest tomorrow is Butch Walker. So that should be a blast.
And I'll be back next week with Kevin Killen.
Amazing.
Oh,
That should be
great.
fun.
Really.
Tim, thank you again. Andrew, thank you so much.
All right. See you, Mark. See you guys. Thank you
next
very
time.
much.